the American lines, the little guy still beating his drum, and suddenly there was total silence on the battlefield as every cannon fell silent, and everyone knew that it was the beginning of the end.
I never heard a drum equal to it. The most delightful music to us all. Ebenezer Denny.
Then Cornwallis had his letter of surrender delivered to Washington.
I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours to settle terms for the surrender of the posts of York and Gloucester. I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient and most humble servant, Cornwallis.
An ardent desire to spare the further effusion of blood will readily incline me to listen to such terms for the surrender of your posts and garrisons of York and Gloucester as are admissible. George Washington.
For the first time in 6 long years of fighting, Washington could claim a victory against British regulars. Cornwallis did not appear at the surrender. His representative, General O'Hara, tried to present his sword to Rochambeau. The French general declined, indicating that Washington was the commander-in-chief. But Washington declined the sword as well, and had his representative, Benjamin Lincoln, who had surrendered the American army at Charleston, accept the enemy's weapon.
Yorktown was the greatest British disaster of the war. The surrender was a most humiliating, of course, a bitter experience for troops who had fought under the colors of their regiments and had to surrender them. They could hardly believe that it was happening to them. They played a tune of the day, the world turned upside down as they marched out.
The mortification and unfeigned sorrow of the soldiers will never fade from my memory. Some went so far as to shed tears, while one man, a corporal who stood near me, embraced his firelock and then threw it on the ground, exclaiming, "May you never get so good a master again." Captain Samuel Graham, British Highlander.
I noticed that the Allied officers and soldiers could scarcely talk for laughing, and they could scarcely walk for jumping and dancing and singing as they went about. An American officer, Yorktown, recounting the evening of surrender.
In London, news of Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown ushered in a new government that was interested in ending the American war and concentrating on the war against France and Spain. In America, the great British defeat came not a moment too soon for the rebels. When Washington's aide, Lieutenant Tench Tillman, rode into Philadelphia to announce the Allied victory, the Congress was so destitute that its members had to reach into their own pockets for $1 apiece to pay for his travel expenses.
Washington was wise enough to know that you can negotiate better from strength than weakness, and he feared that if he discharged his army, England would take advantage of his weakness in the peace negotiations.
In the 2 years from the end of the Battle of Yorktown to the actual signing of the Treaty of Paris, those 2 years, in some ways, were probably the most dangerous of any of the 8 years of the Revolution.
Washington moved his army to Newburgh, New York, where they waited in readiness through a long winter. In 1782, as a second threadbare winter approached, he warned the Congress of his army's growing dissatisfaction.
The temper of the army is much soured and has become more irritable than at any period since the commencement of the war. George Washington.
By early March of 1783, Washington pondered the problem in his Newburgh quarters. Congress had not adequately addressed the Army's grievances, and some of his highest officers had threatened revolt, a military coup.
Every revolution except ours has turned on itself at the end and has devoured itself. Ours didn't, and it didn't because of the person of George Washington.
Washington called for a meeting of the officers at nearby New Windsor, in this large wooden building called the Temple. After some deliberation, he chose to address the group himself.
He told them that they had fought for all of these years for freedom, but there was such animosity in the group toward the way they'd been treated by Congress. He realized that he wasn't reaching them. And in one of those magic moments, he pulled a letter out to read to them from a congressman to prove that Congress was indeed interested in doing what was right by the soldiers and by the officers. He couldn't read it. And there was a moment of quiet as everyone in the room looked up to see what was wrong. He reached into another pocket and pulled out a pair of glasses, put them on, and said,
"Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles. For I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country."
I don't believe anybody in the room heard the words of the letter, because in that moment, he, their commander for 8 years, reached into the heart of every one of them. And witnesses say there was not a dry eye in the room. Washington realized that. He finished reading the letter, folded it up, put it in his pocket, and walked out. From that moment on, there was no longer any thought of the Army rebelling against the Congress. And probably in that moment, in that one moment, Washington had saved the American Revolution.
As Washington struggled with his army's possible revolt in Newburgh, New York, an ocean away in Paris, France, American diplomats led by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams struggled to formally end the long war. The two great patriot leaders continued to maintain a mutual dislike of each other.
You may depend on this. The moment an American minister gives a loose to his passion for women, that moment he is undone. He is instantly at the mercy of the spies of the court, and the tool of the most profligate of the human race. John Adams on Franklin's French diplomacy.
Mr. Adams is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes absolutely out of his senses. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin seldom operated independently as a diplomat. He was usually yoked with a colleague, and the colleagues he was yoked with were almost exclusively brusque, moralistic, and demanding. Franklin was able to appear the soul of accommodation and reason and comparison.
He loves his peace, hates to offend, and seldom gives any opinion until obliged to do so. It is his policy never to say yes or no decidedly. John Adams on Franklin.
Portrait artist Benjamin West was never able to complete this painting of the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty because the British commissioners refused to pose for him. The agreement Franklin and his colleagues reached with Britain at the end of November 1782 had to wait nearly a year to become a formal peace. It was then that Britain finally came to terms with America's allies, France and Spain.
The British came out of the war with surprisingly few losses. The great loss, of course, was the American colonies themselves. Now, whether that was a loss to the British or good riddance is arguable. I can't but feel that Britain was, in the long run, happier without colonies which no longer wanted her.
In fact, soon after the war ended, the United States once more became a part of the British trade empire. So Britain enjoyed the fruits of America without having to administer